I think we could probably begin by, one of the things that I'm always sort of curious about, both about myself and about other collectors, is really, why watches, right? It's an interesting thing to become fascinated by. So maybe, Andrew, we could start just by talking a little bit about how you became interested in watches in the first
Sure.
place.
It's probably too much information, but I grew up around cars and restoring cars. My father was a drag racer, I kid you not. There is an incredible correlation between those people who like airplanes, cars, watches. They seem to all go together. And so that was my kind of transition when I came to New York. I literally was here on a holiday, and I went to Sotheby's. They had a preview for one of their auctions. And I went and I fell in love that day, I think. So that was 1993.
Was it the aesthetics of fine watches that kind of attracted you to them initially, primarily, or were you already sort of curious about the machine aspects of watchmaking as well, the mechanics and how watches actually work?
Like I'm sure many people here, I love things that are beautifully made. The idea that something as complicated as a grand complication watch, which is a minute repeater, a tourbillon, a split-second chronograph, some of these things mechanically that can be put into something, a movement that's no more than 35 millimeters across is extraordinary. Take some of these very complicated Vacherons. You could send it, this was Jack's analogy, not mine, you could send it back in time 200 years, and a watchmaker 200 years ago would know how to fix a watch that was made today. I view that not as a lack of progress. I view that as a continuation of an extraordinary tradition.
So you look at advertisements for luxury watches from the 1940s and 1950s, and what you see again and again and again is an emphasis on precision, accuracy, robustness, and reliability, right? And it's ubiquitous pretty much across the advertisements that you see. So while it's largely true, although I think that a very high precision mechanical timepiece, you might actually, if you're lucky, get better timekeeping than with a very cheap, badly constructed quartz watch.
The thing that I find actually equally interesting is that a lot of folks, when they buy their first high-end watch, and for those of you who are going to do it or thinking about doing it, you will have to send the watch in for service, okay? And it will take a long time to get it back, okay? It's not like going to your local watch store and putting in a new battery and going on your way. These are handcrafted items, and some of them have to go back to Switzerland. Most of them don't these days, unless they're very complicated. But it takes time to clean them every 3 or 4 years.
Well, that's an interesting point. There's a friend of mine who he doesn't anymore because he's working as a professional in the industry now, but he used to write watch reviews online for one of the discussion forums. And one of his reviews started out, "Watches are machines," which seems like a very obvious statement to make, but it's something that the consumer doesn't necessarily think about until suddenly the machine doesn't function as expected, or it's time for it to go in for service.
Yeah.
Did that come as a surprise to you, the necessity for a watch to be serviced?
Yes, no two ways about it. And then unfortunately, my grandfather passed away right after I started getting into watches, and I inherited this beautiful piece from him from the 30s, a very fine watch from the 30s. Very simple, but actually, let me emphasize that, very simple. All it did was tell the hours and the minutes.
To time only.
Time only watch. And so I sent it back to this well-known manufacturer. And of course, it had to go back to Switzerland. Right. And they told me they had to remake some wheels, inside the watch to make it work again. And it was like $4,700. To make it work again. Right. So I said, I'll take it back, please. So
right.
Anyway, so that's another long answer to your question, but I was surprised.
One of the things that I always sort of wonder about is how do we evaluate quality in a fine timepiece? What makes us, we come in with a certain set of presumptions that we trust the story, in other words. We trust the narrative that we have in our minds that, this object represents craftsmanship, it represents history, it represents, a genuine commitment on the part of the folks who've made it to creating something that has functional integrity and is beautiful, right? So we buy into that narrative,
Yep.
but how do we know?
How do we know?
Right?
I don't have a great answer for that. Maybe you do. I'm at the point now where I've learned enough from others that, when I go, especially with a vintage piece, I love vintage. If I'm going to buy a vintage piece, the retailer or the seller needs to take the case back off for me, and I can take a high power loop, and I know what to look for. So I think that's for instance, if a novice watch collector were to take a high power loop and look at a brand new Vacheron, and then look at a watch that costs 25% as much from whomever, there's no question in my mind that first-time collector could tell the difference in how well that Vacheron was made.
For a beginning collector, if someone were to come up to you and say, I don't know anything about watches, I've become interested in them, I think that watches from let's say brands like Patek and Vacheron and Audemars, I think they're beautiful looking objects, but I really would like to learn more. Where can I go? Where should I go for information?
I do think online is important. There's a group I joined that I was invited to, actually thanks to Vacheron recently, called Watch Enthusiasts of New York. I mean, I learned more in a dinner there than I probably learned in a year, reading watch magazines. So I think that's the best source is other collectors, because they've probably been through or researched what you've researched or been through or want to go through.
Right. There has been a fairly significant increase over the last 10 years in the retail costs of fine watches.
Yeah.
There has been in some cases, absolutely astronomical increase in value in watches sold in the secondary market, watches sold at auction, and we have seen, in some cases, watches that sold for a few $100s when they were new, selling for tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. We all respond to, or those of us who love watches as objects of craft and as aesthetic objects, we respond to them on that level. Have you ever bought a watch primarily because you felt it represented a robust investment? And what would you say to someone who is considering buying a watch primarily for that reason?
Oh boy, that's a can of worms.
Yeah, that's why I asked.
Yeah. Listen, there are purists out there who say, it shouldn't be about that. It shouldn't be about the investment. But that would be, it'd be incredibly misleading. These are phenomenally expensive things, even for very wealthy people. To not think of the residual value, I think, would be foolish.
One of the interesting questions that arises when you think about buying a fine watch is, where am I going to be with this piece in 10 years or 20 years, both in terms of the degree to which it retains its value and the degree to which it can be kept functioning, right? And I think one of the things that people find reassuring about a company like Vacheron or a company like Patek or a company like Rolex, for that matter, is that these are companies that have in the 250 plus years that Vacheron Constantin has been around, it's weathered a few geopolitical ups and downs, presumably, right? So you have a sense of confidence that you're dealing with a company that is going to be around to take care of the watch that you've bought. Do you feel that the introduction of high-tech fabrication techniques, whether for decorative or for functional purposes, adds to or detracts from the perceived value of a watch, from your perceived value of a watch? Does it take away from the story, from the romance?
I'm going to answer it kind of on the fly. I think, to answer your question, if you sent that same watch back in time and the watchmaker said, I don't know what that is because of what it's made out of, I think he'd say, okay, that's made out of something I don't know, but I'll go down to the local blacksmith and I'll make something out of metal to replace it with. Right. My point being that the design of the watch and the heart of the watch is still the same. If the watch industry doesn't move on, like everything else, it goes the way of Blockbuster Video. So I don't have a problem with those sorts of nuances.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I think we're pretty much out of time. And thank you very much to our hosts and to all of you for joining us this morning. I hope it was of interest.
Thank you.
Thank you.